recognize the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
The lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm glad you're here. If you would please subscribe to our podcast and leave a 5-star rating or give us a thumbs up, depending on your platform, we would really appreciate it. Now I want to get right to my guest. Robin Fivush is the Samuel Candor Dobbs Professor of Psychology at Emory University, where she's been on the faculty since 1984. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 1983, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, San Diego from 1983 to 84. And she is a fellow of both the American Psychological Society and the American Psychological Association. Robin, welcome to Sagely Speaking. We are so happy to have you today.
Thank you, Mary, and I'm so excited to be here to talk with you about family storytelling and all the work that my colleagues and students have been doing over the years.
It's fabulous. And, we came about you. My producer, Kim, found one of your publications and she said, wow, this is amazing. This is something we've been talking about, but not as clearly as Robin has done. So talk to us. Storytelling. I think we all know storytelling is something that connects us as human beings, but we consider it an afterthought. Is that true? And what is your research saying?
We do consider it an afterthought because it's kind of like fish swimming in water. Don't think about water. Human beings tell stories. It's what we do. It's who we are. It's how we talk in everyday language. By some estimates, stories account for like 40% of our conversations. We're constantly telling people what we did today, what we did last week, what we did last summer, what we did years and years ago.
What about people who make up their stories? Is that good too?
Well, it depends what you mean by make up stories. So memory is not a video recorder. Everything we remember is filtered through subsequent experiences. We're telling stories for particular reasons to particular people. So it's not necessarily that our stories of our own experiences aren't true. It's sometimes they're embellished, or we add some details, or we leave some things out that we don't want to tell. Very few people actually make up whole cloth stories about themselves that are completely
I definitely find the older we get, and the more I hang around good friends who are even older than I am, we do tell a lot of stories. We reminisce a lot. We remember the good old days. But what about when you're remembering the bad times and the bad old days? And I want to tell you about a little thing that I have on Let Your Lowlights Become Your Highlights. But what about, is it equally good to tell stories about the bad times as the good times? And I mean traumatic times. I don't mean, I walked to school both ways uphill.
Yeah, or even worse. Unfortunately, many of us have really experienced horrible things in our lives. Deaths of loved ones, serious illnesses. And of course, so many people in the world live under such horribly challenging circumstances. And I don't want to minimize that in any way. We tell stories of different kinds of events for different reasons. So when we tell stories about good times, reminiscing with friends, or in my work, really focusing on families, it's to laugh together, it's to bond together, it's to create that positive sense of life is good and joyful. And we need that joy in our lives. But we also need to talk about the bad stuff that happened. We have to process it. We have to understand it. We have to learn how to live with it. And we also need to console each other. When we talk about it with other people, we start to understand it in new ways. Maybe in ways that are not so chaotic and undermining, but ways that help us to put it in its place and understand that we can still persevere. And particularly for young children and young adults, they have to learn how to regulate their emotions and figure out how to live beside the bad things and really embrace the good things.
Right. And it seems that as society, especially here in the U.S., we've gotten to a point where dinner as a family is sort of another afterthought, or we do not recognize the significance and importance of coming together and bonding over a meal. And now with fast food and fast food deliveries, and it's almost like every parent has to be a short order cook because everybody wants something different and things are ready at different times. I mean, that moment in time, that hour, that 45 minutes, let alone doing the dishes together and all that other stuff that having dinner together takes. Are we moving back to that? Are people recognizing that this is the primitive version of group therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, we're always nostalgic about the past. In the good old days, we used to eat dinner together with our family all the time. It turns out that those patterns haven't changed as much as we think they have. Families still eat dinner together 4 or 5 times a week, by most reports. Now, sometimes they're not cooking big elaborate dinners. Maybe they are ordering DoorDash, but they're sitting down together over that. And it's, again, dinner time is an important context because it is a break from the day at the end of the day to kind of come back together and have this conversation. But it's not the only time that families have these kinds of conversations. Stories come up when you're getting up in the morning and getting ready to go to work. They come up when you're watching TV shows. They come up all the time in the car. They come up, bedtime routines. So, yes, family dinner time is an important context for sharing conversation and bonding and sharing stories, but it's not the only context. And the other thing is, it's great when families as a whole come together. But pieces of families come together too. Just, mom and her son, dad and the daughter, or the siblings. Not every story has to be shared with every family member. Sometimes having those special stories just with your mom is special too.
Oh, that's a great point. I like that. When I listen to you, part of me says, but if for my family, it would only take 15 minutes before something goes awry. Somebody's feelings are hurt. Somebody gets angry. I mean, don't even dare talk about politics at the dinner table of my family because people are all over the place and they're very passionate about what they believe in. They are passionate that they're passionate. I'll just put it that way. How do you deal in that situation? Not every family conversation is exactly, let's just say, fun.
That's certainly true. And not every family is the same, of course. Tolstoy famously said, all happy families are alike. All unhappy families are uniquely different. No family, everybody says, I come from a dysfunctional family. I think the notion of what a functional family is almost a myth. I mean, we have norms, and we know a lot about how families that are happier function. They're more trusting, there's more open communication. But no family is perfect, and every family has warts, and every family has arguments and disagreements. The question is, can you work through those? And stories help us work through them, or can help us work through them. So,
Robyn,
for example, I'll give you an example because I've spent a lot of time in other people's homes listening to their stories. And often it's mothers and daughters. I have to tell you that especially with teenagers, where there's a lot of friction, and mothers will then tell stories to their daughters about things that happened with their mothers. Even tell stories of transgressions, like when they ran away. And those stories really resonate because they help to create a sense of, okay, maybe you do get what I'm going through. Maybe you do understand me. So again, going back to what you asked earlier, it's important to share those more negative stories as well.
Absolutely. I was thinking, I mentioned how lowlights become highlights. In my experience, and I speak about this when I speak publicly, there are things we do in our lives that are, I call them boneheaded. They're mistakes that are embarrassing. You shouldn't have done them. One example I love to use is of my husband. We were in Scotland and obviously driving on the wrong side of the road. He should be a better driver than he is because he's a astronaut. You'd think you could actually drive pretty well, but throw in driving on the wrong side of the road in Scotland, and he ran into the curb and blew the tire. And in Edinburgh, and that's a big deal, right? You're in some foreign country and you blow a tire and it's traumatic and you kind of get tense and mad at each other. But fast forward 10 years, we laugh about that now so much. We incorporate it into, I don't know, picking on each other with family and people we love. And so I call it, let your lowlights become your highlights. And I think sometimes it takes healing to get to know, yes, you did something very boneheaded, but you know what, you're still loved anyway. And I think for myself and my kids, that's a lot of our relationship too, is, something happened. And so it is that conversation or something relatable that I might mention that this is where I screwed up too. And look, it happens. And I think that's so important. But how fascinating, how you made a career out of this. What made you decide this is worthy of study on its own right?
Go back to the lowlights into highlights.
Okay.
Because it's similar. I'll tell you, my husband and I also have the opportunity to travel quite a lot. And something always goes wrong.
Yeah.
Something always goes wrong. And our mantra has become, if we get out of this, this is going to be a great story.
There you go.
And then it becomes like the highlight of the vacation reel, because it now becomes funny or poignant or meaningful in a different kind of way. That's not just travel. That's life. Nobody gets through life without doing, as you said, without doing dumb things and or getting into trouble and or unfortunate things happen. And it's kind of like, well, how do I deal with this? And one of the ways we deal with things is by creating funny stories out of them, redemptive stories. I got something out of it. Even though it was a bad experience, I learned something. I grew stronger. It turns out it was funny, whatever it is. And I think that is definitely something that Americans do. It's something about our cultural story, which is one of always progressing and always seeing the bright side of things and always seeing the positive things that come out of the hard times.
I did ask you how you got into this, but let me push that back a little bit to ask you a follow-on question on that. Is it generationally more difficult right now when kids are, we tend to have shorter attention spans. We have so many distractions. Of course, social media comes to mind. Electronics as a whole come to mind. I admit I have that impulse. A lot of people do. If I haven't checked my phone in a minute, I get a little vibration in my hand. Time to check your phone. But is it a lot harder? Is the anxiety level our kids have? Because it's so hard to take life slowly any longer. Everything's instantaneous, quick gratification.
I think like everything else, pros and cons. We always think the past was better than it was. The past was really kind of difficult. There were a lot of really hard times that our grandparents and parents went through. As for this generation, the argument that, they're the anxious generation, mental health problems are on the increase, there's truth to that. Part of it is better monitoring and better awareness, but part of it is, yes, they are definitely a more anxious generation. Maybe it's social media. They also, frankly, went through a worldwide pandemic. Mm-hmm. They were locked in their houses for a year and a half at a critical developmental period and didn't have, think about the kinds of experiences you had as a high school senior, or if you went to college, your first year in college or your first year in the workplace. They missed out on that. So yes, I think that there are generational differences, but there were generational differences for, kids who came of age during the Great Depression, during World War II, during the Vietnam War, during the Civil Rights Movement. Every generation is defined by some turmoil, by some change, by some issue that becomes a generationally defining set of events.
My parents were children of the Depression, and then my dad was a waist gunner in World War II. And I think about, it seems that the World War II veterans came home. Obviously, I wasn't born until much later, but my father, and I've heard from other children of World War II veterans, that their parents were reluctant. The father was reluctant to speak about the experiences in the war. And I don't know if they buried their PTSD. They figured, I do remember my dad saying, I just did what I had to do. And that was pretty much the extent of it. And so hopefully we're a little bit beyond that. But and I don't even know where I'm going with this point, other than what you're saying hit a chord with me in that, yes, every generation has its challenges. I think Vietnam was unique because, our soldiers and airmen and crewmen came back without the hero's welcome and with the stigma that was thrust upon them. And of course, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, all these things since. But yes, COVID had its unique set of circumstances in that you took away the fellowship and the camaraderie and the friendships, unless they went virtual. But at what point in your career did you say, this is a whole thing I'm going to focus on and study? Because again, to everybody, this is like, duh, how did we not know this? And
we
you go,
did know it.
They don't know it. Okay.
I want to be very clear. I don't want to claim that, I discovered that family stories are good for us. Everybody knows this. I talk to a lot of parents groups, grandparents groups, and everybody, we all know this. We know telling stories is fun. We know telling stories is meaningful. We know it's important. What I will take credit for is I have shown empirically the specific ways in which it actually does have positive outcome for young adults, that it really does increase self-esteem. It increases a sense of meaning and purpose in life. So I've showed the ways in which these family stories operate. And I've also, looked at the different kinds of stories, like the question you started with. Well, is it good to tell bad stories? Is it good to tell stories of challenge? And the answer is yes, it is, when you tell them in kind of developmentally appropriate ways. There are certain stories you don't want to tell very young kids. And when you tell them in ways that help you work through them, rather than just ruminate about them. So if you go down an emotional abyss where it was awful, that's probably not great. But if you can kind of engage in, it was awful, we accept that it was awful, but we persevered, we got through it, we learned the family was strong, I learned how much my mother loved me. Something that you can create some kind of positive meaning out of it that helps us to move on. And or just knowing that we have someone who understands what we've been through.
Absolutely.
So I think there's that. But how did I get into this? Well, I kind of fell into it with the families that I worked with. So I started working with very young children. I was very interested in what very young children remember about their early experiences. Because as adults, we don't really remember much about our childhood. We can't remember things that happened when we were really, really young, before we were 3 or 4 or even 5. And I was curious about that. Nobody had ever actually asked kids what they remember. Everybody asked adults, what's your earliest memory? But nobody went to 3-year-olds and said, do you remember last Christmas? So, turns out they do, but in very, very fragmented ways. And I thought it would be interesting to have mothers help them remember. I thought, well, their mothers, know more about what happened, and their mothers can kind of help me guide. But then it turns out, what I discovered from that is that the mothers were really helping their children construct these stories about their own experiences. That children were learning how to talk about their own experiences by creating stories with their mothers. And that really interested me. And I started to think about, what does that mean for our memories? It goes back to what you said about people who make up memories. All of our memories are created in these social interactions that we share with other people. And they're marinated in what other people say and how other people react. And then my colleague, Marshall Duke, who is a clinical psychologist, got me thinking about older kids and adolescents who are often struggling. They're struggling trying to figure out, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? I've been living in this wonderful family environment, maybe not so wonderful family environment for those of us who aren't lucky, right? But now I'm going to be asked to kind of strike out on my own. Who am I? Who do I want to be? So they're going through what's called an identity crisis. How do these stories help them create an identity? So we started just listening to families who had adolescents talk about their past experiences together. And it turns out that they're doing all of this stuff without even thinking about it. They're telling these stories and they're helping their adolescents create more coherent accounts, figure out who they are in their family history, anchor them in the present by telling them about the past. So our families really guided us.
I know that's certainly true in my case. I'm very, very proud of, my roots and where I came from and hearing those stories of the Great Depression and World War II and the GI Bill and everything thereafter. And yes, we had some significant challenges, but the foundational core, weirdly, Robyn, when I ran for Congress in 1998, that was the basis that I ran on. Was that I had this background of, it was the stories of my father, because, his service, he was drafted into the Army Air Corps and at 18, and it became who he was for a short period of time. But to me, it encompassed so much more: service, humility, patriotism, the sort of bedrock foundations that I ran on. I took, and then my mother also was a brilliant woman, a chemist. And she worked for a short stint on the Manhattan Project. A lot of this rich tapestry that I learned around the dinner table and at home, that was my foundation to run for office.
I think that is such, that in and of itself is such a powerful story. And if you think about not just politics, but you go for a job interview or you're meeting a possible romantic partner, everybody's going to say, who are you? And part of who you are is, where did you come from? Who are your parents? Who is your family? Sometimes it's not positive, like you had these unbelievably positive. Sometimes it's stories of unbelievable hardship and or difficulty and challenge. I'm thinking about children of Holocaust survivors who clearly don't have stories of the kind of powerful parents, but their parents were powerful in that they survived and live to tell the story. And that shapes them in a different way. But it's always about values and about meaning and about who you are in the world, how you're anchored.
Well, Robyn, I have to say this. You said you weren't the first to discover this or to talk about it, but I will give you kudos for shining a spotlight on it for people like me and Kim to stumble across and have the light bulb go off and realize, wow, what we take as ordinary is actually superhuman. This ability to get together. And so you open our eyes and minds, and we talk a lot about adolescence and the struggles, and of course with the addiction issues and everything that plagues us in society right now in that regard. It's not just a child, being exposed to addiction or developing a substance use disorder, but now it's a dangerous substance in the supply chain, and one pill can kill them. And so it's entirely different, but we do talk a lot about that. And that's where we saw your thing and realized this is a moment of such powerful fellowship, humanity, healing, laughing, all of those things. So I want to give you kudos for that. And I know you're trying to slide it off, but I'm not going to let you do that.
Thank you.
Because I do want to just mention that we found this topic because of you. We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. Mothers for Awareness and Prevention of Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. And now, back to our interview. What happens, and this might be a little bit out of your, where you don't ordinarily go, but how do people deal with somebody who has dementia or Alzheimer's? And the stories are odd. My mother did suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's. I don't know which, and that is what they say she passed with. But towards the end, it's very difficult because the stories they're not real or they, I don't know. I remember showing up one day to visit her in hospice and she was drinking a Coke and she thought she just discovered the greatest thing in the world. And she asked me what it was and she's holding a Coke can. So, and we all know how hard it is to be a caregiver, but how do you deal with stories in that circumstance? Is it still possible?
That's a hard question to answer. And there's actually a good bit of research going on now, actually a lot of it in Denmark, on helping families with an older person with dementia, whatever the cause, Alzheimer's or cognitive decline of other sorts, how you can create environments that help them to remember who they are and share that with their family. It's very hard, but there is some evidence that if you can put people back in familiar environments, so giving them objects from their childhood or particularly adolescence or early adulthood, or, things that might remind them of periods of life that might be better preserved in memories, because we know earlier memories are better preserved in Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. But at some point, no. At some point, we can't, which is why it's so important to get the stories. I mean, I think there's two things that I like to tell families. One is for parents who are still raising children, young adults, don't worry about sitting down and saying, oh, I have to tell you stories. I just learned that family stories are important. Sit down, I have to tell you these stories, and you must listen. That's not what it's about. What you need to know is stories happen all the time. Kids pay more and less attention over time. Stories emerge over time, bits and pieces. What we see over the dinner conversation is kids will bring it up. Wait a minute, didn't you tell me something about asparagus when you were a kid? And the mother says, well, yeah, I did. I can't believe you remember that. And a little bit more of the story comes out. That's great. Just relax. And then there are the big stories. It's holiday dinner and we're going to have to tell that story about Uncle Joe because it's a great story. So stories are of all types and kinds. So just relax. But for older people who are dealing with aging parents, don't wait. Don't wait. Get their stories now. Because getting the stories from their experience, from their perspective, is going to be so important. Not just for you, but for the next generations as well.
Robyn, how important are these same conversations amongst just friends? We all have, or hopefully we all have, a group of friends, and my producer Kim is one that every day we hear a new story, tell a new story, laugh at something, share an idea, whatever it is. So I would assume it doesn't have to be the family dinner table. It can be the friends dinner table too. But I do this all the time. I'm putting words in your mouth and hoping you're saying, you're right, Mary.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I want to say two things about that. One is for adolescents and young adults who are trying to figure out who they are in the world, their most important identity figures are still their parents. And what we do know is that the stories they know about their parents when their parents were growing up and their parents' lives are more impactful on their own sense of who they are than stories about their friends. We do know that. But we also know, unfortunately, that there are young adults whose parents don't accept their identity. And for one reason or another, for whether it's political identity or religious identity, gender identity, whatever it is. And those young adults really struggle because they're losing validation from their identity figures. And we are seeing that having identity figures in the community are an important part of that process of healing. But again, it tends to be, it's important to have, for again, adolescents and young adults that I'm focusing on, older people, adults, people who've been through it. They have a different perspective. They provide a different way of constructing the story. Friends are really important too. Friends serve different functions. Now, as we get older, like at my age, where we've had lifetime friends, and they're really essentially family, I think they begin to serve the same function as family. But we don't have as much empirical data on that.
Right. Well, I think when you think of Native American communities and others, this is a part of their culture and heritage so much, and storytelling. And you give me the sense of the elder, and the wise elder whose lived experience needs to be passed on to generations. And obviously, it's more than that here. But I think there probably are some good lessons to be taken from those cultures as well.
I think bringing up Native Americans is really critical. Jill Fish has been doing a lot of work on this. Michael Chandler did work with First Nation in Canada. These are kids who have been ripped from their culture and don't have the cultural historical stories. And they are suffering. And when you create environments in which they can learn about their historical culture from their elders, an amazing amount of healing goes on. We see huge decreases in depression, decreases in suicide, decreases in alcoholism. Being embedded in a strong culture like Native American culture is so critical. And there are so many cultures that do really, emphasize how important knowing your ancestors. Asian cultures, how important knowing your ancestors and revering their stories. Sometimes we lose sight of that in the American culture. We think we're all independent, autonomous agents. We make it ourselves, or, it's up to us to rise or fall. But we're always embedded in these long, critical histories that define who we are.
Is there a risk at all of tribalism that we're enforcing? And I don't believe that to be the case. So I want to hear your thoughts, though, on how do we respect a culture? And I live in Southwest Colorado. I live very close to a number of, of Native American populations and reservations. And I'm not trying to imply that there is this, but I also don't want people to be afraid of this, that there's nothing wrong with me being who I am and you being who you are. And we've gotten to this point that we don't accept people sometimes for who they are and where they came from. We don't respect and rejoice in their individuality. And I know what you're saying is a way to empower that and to free it and to build stronger relationships. And I just want to enforce that. Because I think some people might hear, well, wait a minute, you're talking about creating tribalism here. And I don't think that's the case.
No, not at all. Stories create connections. It is certainly the case that there can be competing cultural narratives. There can be. And those can be very difficult to bridge, absolutely. But stories of individuals, when we hear stories of individuals and can really take their perspective on what their individual experience has been, of their lives and their family life, we gain a perspective and a tolerance. It no longer becomes, a mythic or depersonalized story that we don't accept. It becomes a person's story. And it's very hard to ignore an individual's own experience.
Absolutely, especially one-on-one.
Yes.
And told and told again. Robyn, I want to thank you, but how do people find you? Because I think they're going to find this so interesting. And again, I think they're going to go, oh, what I took for granted is actually one of the hugest, most important moments in life. And to enjoy and savor that moment, is to savor those stories and realize it's a time to be grateful for that conversation. And that's my takeaway from you is you're teaching gratitude for what we take as just mundane. But so how can people find you? Yes,
gratitude and also the value of our own stories and the value of the stories that people share with us, to thank them for sharing those stories with us. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. 2 ways that people can find me. Probably the easiest is my blog on Psychology Today. And if you just Google Robin Fivush at Psychology Today, you'll find it. Or they can find me on my website, robinfivush.com. That's Robyn, Fivush.com.
Which is a fantastic resource. I enjoy looking at it. I think just looking at your website just makes me smile and take again, have some gratitude for the things that I have every day in my life and don't pause to reflect on how important they are. So, Robyn, thank you so much for joining us on Sagely Speaking. I hope you'll come back in the future and talk about more of your findings and how positive life really is when we stop and appreciate these moments. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me and for validating my story.
Well, you're quite welcome. And I want to thank you to my listeners for joining us for this fabulous episode. I hope you learned a lot. I know that I did, and I know I'm going to learn even more. So again, thank you for listening. I want to thank my sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. And until we meet again, to everybody, be well.